38 hours before Arya walked through that door, Troy had already seen what was coming. It did not announce itself. Groups like Lazarus never do. What Troy detected was a pattern. A cluster of authentication requests arriving through a tertiary relay at irregular intervals, probing without urgency, testing without committing. The digital equivalent of someone walking the perimeter of a building and checking every window without trying to open one yet. Patient, deliberate, confident. He escalated. The response was what the response always is when the timing is inconvenient. Document it, monitor it, wait for something concrete. Troy understood exactly what that meant. He was on his own. So he called his sons. Not because there was no one else. Because there was no one else who knew what they knew and could be trusted to work without supervision at the speed the situation required. Kelvin arrived first. Michael 40 minutes later. They asked nothing unnecessary. Troy briefed them in 20 minutes. They were operational in 30. For 36 hours, the three of them ran a counter-intrusion operation that Lazarus never fully understood because they were never shown the real target. Kelvin built a honeypot, a false replica of SafeDat's most sensitive server cluster, convincing enough to hold a sophisticated attacker's attention for a day and a half. Michael tracked every probe, every adjustment, every pivot, and fed that intelligence back so the decoy could evolve faster than the attack. Troy held the real perimeter behind them, closing vulnerabilities as Lazarus tested the edges, making sure nothing behind the false front was ever actually exposed. They slept in rotations. They ate from vending machines. Near hour 28, Kelvin told his brother quietly that their dad had been awake longer than either of them. Michael nodded and went back to his screen. Nobody on that floor knew what they were really looking at. Welcome back, Story family. And if you're new here, hey, we're glad you found us. Make sure you subscribe, like, and drop a comment before you leave. New stories hit this channel all the time, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. And after you watch, tell us what you thought. Your comment might be exactly what someone else needed to hear today. And by doing this, you help more people locate this wonderful story. So don't hold back. Let's talk about it. The day Arya Stark fired Troy Stevens for bringing his kids to work was the same day his kids were the only reason the company still existed. You do not know that yet. Neither did she. Thursday morning arrived at SafeDat hub of innovation and connectivity, the way trouble always arrives at places that cannot afford it. Quietly and without announcing itself at the door. The operations floor was alive in the way a room is alive when something beneath the surface is wrong and everyone can feel it. But nobody has been given permission to say so out loud. Monitors lined every wall, their light cold and blue, cycling through status feeds and authentication logs and system metrics that meant different things depending on who was reading them. Engineers moved between stations with the tight, deliberate efficiency of people who had stopped explaining what they were doing and were simply doing it. The hum of the server infrastructure beneath the floor was constant, the way a heartbeat is constant. Something you only notice when you start listening for it. At the center of the room, at the primary security console, sat two teenage boys. One was 16, one was 14. Both of them had the particular stillness of people who are not watching screens but reading them. Heads slightly forward, eyes tracking data with the unhurried focus of someone who has been at this long enough to know what matters and what doesn't. The older one's fingers moved occasionally across the keyboard. Brief, precise. The younger one had a secondary display pulled up beside the main terminal and was cross-referencing something with the quiet intensity of a person doing arithmetic that has real consequences. Nobody had introduced them. Nobody had explained them. The engineers on the floor had registered their presence the way you register something that doesn't fit a familiar pattern, with a flicker of attention, and then a quiet decision to return to what you were doing. Troy Stevens was the chief of security. If Troy's sons were at the terminal, there was presumably a reason. The room had other problems. Those problems were on every screen in the building. Arya Stark arrived at 8:40 in the morning. She walked through the operations floor the way she always walked through spaces she owned, with direction, with purpose, with the forward momentum of a woman who had stopped waiting for rooms to adjust to her and had simply learned to move through them on her own terms. She was composed. She was focused. She was not looking at the screens. She saw the boys. Her stride slowed, then stopped. For a moment, she simply looked. At the two teenagers at the most sensitive terminal in the most sensitive facility in the state, at their laptops open beside the main console, at the access credentials visible on the secondary display. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not confusion. Recognition of something she had not expected and did not intend to tolerate. She found Troy Stevens 3 feet away. He saw her expression and began to speak. He did not finish. "These are minors." Her voice was level, precise. The tone of someone who has already made the decision and is now simply announcing it. "This is a classified facility. You are done here." Troy said her name. "I need security at the primary console, now." The room froze. Not visibly. Nobody dropped anything. Nobody stopped moving entirely. But the quality of the motion changed. Engineers who had been focused on their own stations became very still in the way people become still when they are trying not to be noticed watching something. Troy tried once more. "Arya, you need to hear what's been happening on this network for the last... You brought children into a classified environment. There is nothing else I need to hear." Two security officers crossed the floor. Troy looked at them. Then he looked at his sons, who had turned from the screens and were watching their father with the composed stillness of boys who had been raised not to make difficult moments harder. Kelvin stood first. Michael closed his laptop, carefully, without rushing, and stood beside his brother. Troy did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He looked once, just once, back at the terminals his sons had been running, at the screens still scrolling, at the work that had no one left to watch it now. Then they walked to the exit. The door closed. The screens kept running. For 11 more minutes, they would keep running exactly as the boys had left them, holding a line that nobody in the building knew existed, defending a wall nobody else could see. 11 minutes. That was all the time left. To understand what walked out of that building, you have to understand who Troy Stevens actually was. Not the title, not the badge, not the carefully worded employment contract that gave him a senior role and a competitive salary in the place where equity should have been. Those things described his position. They did not describe him. Troy Stevens was 41 years old, and he carried it the way certain men carry experience. Not loudly, not as a credential, but as a kind of settled weight that you feel before you can name it. He was broad-shouldered and unhurried, measured in the specific way people become measured when they have learned, through enough hard lessons, that raising their voice costs more than it ever earns. He did not perform competence. He simply had it, the way a surgeon has it, or a master electrician. Not as something he announced, but as something that showed up in how he moved through a problem. His discipline was defensive systems architecture, the unglamorous, invisible, load-bearing work of making sure that the things people depend on do not break. He was, by any honest measure, one of the best in the country at it. SafeDat hub of innovation and connectivity existed in its current form largely because of him. He had been there from the beginning. Back when it was a mid-size regional operation with ambition, it had not yet earned the infrastructure to support. Troy had built the security framework the company still ran on, designed the layered authentication system that had kept the facility breach-free for 7 consecutive years, written the protocols that other engineers inherited without always knowing who had written them, or why the decisions had been made the way they had. He understood the architecture the way only the person who built something from the ground up ever truly understands it. Not just how it was designed to function, but how it had evolved, where it was fragile, and what it would take to break it. He did not own any of it. That part of the story is quieter and harder and necessary to understand. Arya Stark and Troy Stevens had built SafeDat together. Partners in the fullest sense of that word. Professionally and, for a time, personally. They had shared the early years of it, the lean ones, the ones where the vision was larger than the resources, and the gap between the two was closed mostly by will and long hours, and a shared belief that what they were building was worth the cost of building it. And then the company succeeded. And success, it turned out, was where their partnership ended, The legal maneuvering that followed was quiet and surgical. Troy did not see it coming in time to stop it, which was precisely how it had been designed. By the time the structure of the company had been formalized, he was holding a senior title and a salary where co-ownership should have been. The equity he had earned, in every meaningful sense of that word, had been redirected into a structure that protected her position and left him with the functional role without the foundational stake. He stayed. Not because he had forgiven it. He had not. And he was honest enough with himself not to pretend otherwise. He stayed because leaving would have meant handing the infrastructure he had built to people who did not understand it deeply enough to protect it. The work was too important, and the people depending on it, the companies, the institutions, the citizens whose most sensitive data lived inside those servers, had not been part of any of the decisions that had brought him to this point. They had no say in any of it. Walking away from the system to settle a personal score would have meant making them pay for a debt they did not owe. So he stayed. He did his work. He carried what he carried without putting it down in public. At home, he was a father. And that, more than any professional credential, more than any framework he had written or system he had designed, was the thing that had actually mattered most. Kelvin was 16. He had inherited Troy's patience, his precision, his willingness to sit with a problem long past the point where most people would have moved on. He was the kind of teenager who could spend 4 hours on a single vulnerability and come up from it, not frustrated but satisfied, the way you are satisfied when you finally find the thing that was hiding. Michael was 14, and he had gotten something different from his father. The instincts, the appetite, the ability to feel when something was wrong before he could fully articulate why, and to follow that feeling into the problem rather than away from it. He was faster than his brother and slightly less careful, which meant together they covered ground neither of them would have covered alone. Troy had taught them both. Not with a curriculum, not with structured lessons or formal progression. He had taught them the way a craftsman teaches, through proximity, through repetition, through the slow and irreplaceable accumulation of genuine understanding that only comes from doing the work alongside someone who knows what the work actually is. They had grown up watching him think, watching him build, watching him diagnose systems the way a doctor diagnoses a patient, with attention, with patience, with the willingness to look past the obvious symptom to the underlying cause. By the time Kelvin was 16 and Michael was 14, they did not just understand SafeDat's architecture in the abstract. They knew it the way you know the house you grew up in. Every corridor, every room, every door that sticks, and every window that was never quite properly sealed. Every place something could get in. And every place, if you knew what you were doing, that you could make it believe it already had. 38 hours before Arya Stark walked through that door, Troy Stevens was already fighting a war nobody else could see. It started the way the serious ones always start. Not with noise, not with alarms or obvious intrusion signatures or the kind of dramatic system failure that fills a room with urgency and gives everyone something clear to respond to. It started with a pattern. Small, precise, and wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate immediately but impossible to ignore once recognized. A cluster of authentication requests, arriving through a tertiary relay at the edge of the network, a low-priority pathway, the kind that exists at the margins of large infrastructure because legacy systems accumulate them the way old buildings accumulate side doors. The requests were spaced at irregular intervals, not random. Irregular in the specific way that something is irregular when it is deliberately avoiding the rhythm that automated filters are calibrated to flag. Troy saw it on a Tuesday evening, 40 minutes before he had planned to go home. He did not go home. Lazarus does not breach. That is the thing that makes them different from the groups that make noise and get caught quickly. They do not force entry. They do not overwhelm systems or trigger visible failures or announce themselves with the kind of aggressive intrusion that security teams are trained to recognize and respond to. They probe. They map. They wait with the patience of something that is not in a hurry because it is already confident about the outcome. They find the door that has been standing slightly open without anyone noticing. And then, when the conditions are exactly right, they walk through it. Troy knew their signature. He had studied them the way a doctor studies a disease they have not yet treated, but know is coming. The pattern in the relay was theirs. He was certain of it within the hour. He escalated immediately, sent the report up through proper channels with the specific, documented clarity of someone who understood that the next 24 hours mattered more than the next 24 days. The response came back by morning. Monitor it. Document it. Avoid creating alarm until there is something concrete to present. Troy read it once. Then he set it aside. He understood exactly what it meant. The timing was inconvenient. There were stakeholder meetings scheduled. There were optics to manage. A major incident report. Arriving without the kind of visible, obvious crisis that justifies the disruption it causes was the kind of thing that made leadership uncomfortable in ways they preferred not to be made uncomfortable. He was on his own. He had known, somewhere beneath the surface of the formal escalation, that this was how it would go. He had sent the report because the process required it. He had not sent it because he expected help. He picked up his phone and called Kelvin. "I need you here. Bring your laptop. No elaboration, no context." Kelvin asked one question: "How bad?" And Troy said, "Bad enough that I called you first." That was the end of the conversation. Michael got the same call 20 minutes later and asked no questions at all. They arrived within the hour. Kelvin first, backpack over one shoulder, reading the room before he had fully cleared the door. Michael behind him, already pulling out his laptop before he sat down. The way someone does when they have been briefed not by words but by their father's tone of voice and know that getting set up quickly is the first useful thing they can do. Troy briefed them in 20 minutes. Clean, precise, no wasted language. By the time he finished, both boys had the shape of the problem. By the time 30 minutes had passed, they were operational. What followed was not visible heroism. It did not look like anything from the outside. It looked like a tired man and two teenagers who had no business being in a classified facility, sitting at terminals, doing quiet work that nobody around them fully understood. What it actually was a 36-hour counter-intrusion campaign run against one of the most sophisticated hacker collectives operating anywhere in the world. And it was working. Kelvin built the honeypot, a false replica of SafeDat's most sensitive server cluster, convincing enough in its architecture, its traffic patterns, its response behaviors to hold Lazarus's attention completely. He fed it to them in pieces, one breadcrumb at a time, each one slightly more interesting than the last, building a picture of a target worth the patience they had already invested. It was, in the specific language of his discipline, a masterwork of misdirection. Michael tracked the attack in real time. Every probe Lazarus sent, every adjustment they made when a pathway didn't respond the way they expected, every small pivot in their approach. Michael cataloged it, analyzed it, and fed it back to Kelvin so the decoy could evolve. Faster than the attack. Always one step ahead, because the only way to hold a group like Lazarus in a false architecture is to make the false architecture feel like it is fighting back just enough to be believable. Troy held the real perimeter behind them, closing vulnerabilities as Lazarus tested the edges, patching the places where the real system was exposed, quietly and without triggering the kind of activity that would signal to the attackers that anyone knew they were there. They did not sleep. Not properly. They rotated, 45 minutes each, on a couch in the back of the operations floor while the other two held the line. They ate whatever the vending machines offered. They did not complain. There was nothing to complain about that would have changed anything. Near hour 28, Kelvin looked up from his screen and said quietly to his brother, "Dad's been awake longer than both of us combined." Michael glanced toward their father's station. Troy was leaning forward slightly, reading a log display with the focused stillness of someone who was running on something beyond tired, but had not yet found a reason to stop. Michael looked back at his screen. "Then we don't stop either." The engineers on the floor saw them. Of course they did. Two teenagers at a classified terminal were not invisible. But the assumptions people make when they do not have full context are shaped by the most comfortable explanation available, and the most comfortable explanation was that Troy Stevens had some unconventional but presumably authorized reason for having his sons present. Nobody asked directly. Nobody escalated it. Until Thursday morning. until Arya walked through the door and the entire architecture of the last 36 hours, every layer of it, every careful and sleepless construction, walked out of the building in 45 seconds. The screens kept running behind them. For now, 11 minutes. That is how long it took. Not hours. Not a prolonged deterioration that gave someone time to notice and intervene. 11 minutes from the moment the door closed behind Troy and his sons to the moment the first domino fell, quietly, without drama, in the way that the most consequential failures always begin. A senior engineer named Hartwell was running a routine bandwidth audit on the secondary terminals when he noticed it. Unfamiliar processes, running hard. Consuming network resources at a rate that had no obvious justification attached to it. No ticket, no authorization flag, no documentation in the system log explaining what they were or who had initiated them. Just processes, running, pulling bandwidth, doing something that nobody currently in the building could account for. Hartwell was not careless. He was, by every reasonable measure, doing exactly what his role required him to do. An undocumented process consuming significant resources on a classified terminal is precisely the kind of thing a responsible engineer terminates first and investigates second. The alternative, leaving unknown scripts running on sensitive infrastructure because they might theoretically be important, is not a policy any serious facility can operate under. He looked at the process IDs. He checked for associated tickets. He found nothing that connected them to any authorized operation currently on record. He terminated them. It took 4 keystrokes. For approximately 90 seconds, nothing changed. The monitors ran normally. The authentication feeds cycled. The bandwidth numbers settled back into expected ranges. If Hartwell felt anything in that 90 seconds, it was probably the small, clean satisfaction of having caught something anomalous and handled it correctly. Then, Lazarus moved. They detected the shift in 4 minutes. Not because they were watching for it specifically, but because they had been mapping the behavior of their target for 36 hours, and they knew, with the precision of people who had been patient long enough to earn certainty, exactly how the false architecture was supposed to respond. When it stopped responding, when the honeypot's traffic patterns went silent, and the decoy signatures disappeared simultaneously, they understood immediately what had happened. Not a system failure, a removal, which meant the real architecture was right there, unobstructed, exactly where it had always been, just behind the curtain that had been held in front of it for a day and a half. They did not hesitate. They had not come this far to hesitate. Every probe they had been running against the false target pivoted in the same moment, redirected toward the real server cluster with the focused efficiency of something that has been waiting and is now, finally, no longer waiting. The patience was over. The door was open. They walked through it. Pause here for a second. Because this is the part where most people reading this ask the same question. What would you have done? If you were Hartwell, if you saw undocumented processes running on a classified terminal and had no context, no briefing, no one to call who could explain it, would you have terminated them? Be honest. Most of us would have done exactly what he did. That is what makes this so hard to look at directly. The first alarm fired at 11:22 in the morning. It was not the loud, cinematic kind. It was a single alert on a monitoring dashboard, a transaction authentication anomaly, flagged automatically by a system that had detected a mismatch between expected and actual routing behavior. The kind of alert that, on an ordinary day, would have been investigated and resolved within minutes. This was not an ordinary day. By the time the second alert fired, 40 seconds later, 3 engineers had already converged on the primary console. By the time the third came, the monitoring dashboard had shifted from green to amber across 6 separate nodes. By the time the 4th and 5th arrived in rapid succession, the senior engineer on duty had already picked up his phone. The monitors turned red in sequence. Not all at once. Station by station, spreading across the operations floor from left to right, like lights going out in reverse. Each one a different system, a different layer of the infrastructure, a different point where Lazarus had found purchase and was now moving deeper. The engineers watching it happen had the particular stillness of people who understand exactly how serious something is and are afraid to say it plainly because saying it plainly would make it more real. Calls went out. Department heads were reached. The CTO was pulled off a client call. Nobody had a plan. Not because they were incompetent, they were not, but because the plan had belonged to the three people who were no longer in the building. Everything Troy and his sons had built existed only in the system and in their heads. The honeypot architecture, the counterprobe misdirection logic, the map of exactly where Lazarus was probing and why they were being pointed away from the real target. None of it had been formally documented. None of it had been briefed to anyone else. There had not been time, and Troy had not been given the audience. The engineers on the floor were doing their best work. Their best work was not enough. Not for this. Not without context they did not have. This is the moment. Right here. 36 hours of invisible work dismantled in 11 minutes by a decision that was entirely reasonable given what Hartwell knew, which was nothing. Drop a comment below. What do you do if you are in that room right now? Do you call Troy? Do you try to rebuild something you have never seen? Do you let it run and hope? Because the people in that building had to answer that question in real time, with red monitors and an active breach and no map. Keep reading, because what happened next is the part nobody saw coming. Somewhere across the city, in a quiet apartment, a man was asleep on his couch in his work clothes. His phone was on his chest. It had not rung yet. The CTO had offered to go. Two other senior managers had volunteered within minutes of each other, both of them with the particular eagerness of people who understood that someone needed to make this trip and were quietly relieved to have a reason to be the one who did it, instead of Arya. She had declined all of them. Not because she was being noble, not because some rehearsed instinct about executive accountability had kicked in at the right moment. She declined because some part of her, the part that had not yet found a comfortable framing for what the last 3 hours had revealed, understood that sending someone else would be its own kind of statement. A proxy was a buffer. A buffer was a way of managing the distance between yourself and the full weight of what you had done. She was not willing to manage that distance today. She picked up her keys and drove herself. The neighborhood was quiet in the way that neighborhoods are quiet on a Thursday mid-morning. The particular stillness of a place where people have already left for the day, and the ones who remain are not announcing themselves. Older construction, modest. The kind of street where people lived actual lives rather than performing them. Arya sat in her car for a moment after she parked. She was not someone who needed to compose herself before difficult conversations. She had built a career on walking into hard rooms and not flinching. But this was not a hard room in any sense she had been trained for. This was a door she had to knock on and ask, from the other side of everything she had taken and everything she had done that morning. For help, she had not earned the right to need. She got out of the car, she walked to the door. She knocked. Silence. Then, after a long moment, the sound of movement inside. The door opened. Michael Stevens stood in the frame in the same hoodie he had been wearing at the terminal that morning, a bowl of cereal held loosely in one hand. He was 14 years old, and he looked at Arya Stark with the kind of unhurried, level assessment that most adults spend decades trying to develop, and some never manage at all. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked like someone who had already worked out the most likely reason for her arrival and was simply confirming it. Behind him, visible through the open doorway, Kelvin sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open. He had looked up when the door opened. He did not look away. On the couch, Troy was asleep. He was still in his work clothes, the same ones from the night before, the same ones he had been wearing when security walked him out of the building. One shoe was on, one was off, as if he had started to remove it and run out of whatever was left before he could finish. His phone rested on his chest, face up, screen dark. His head was turned slightly to one side. He looked, Arya thought, like a man who had not chosen to stop. Like a man who had simply reached the end of what his body had left and gone down where he stood. Before we go further, take a moment with this image. A man who spent 36 hours defending a company that was never fully his, fired before he could explain himself, asleep on his couch with one shoe on and his phone on his chest in case an alert came through. What are you feeling right now? Drop it in the comments, because what Arya felt standing in that doorway is about to matter. Michael looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, simply and without drama, "Dad said something really bad was coming. He called us because he didn't have anyone else." He was not accusing her. His voice carried none of the sharpness that the words could have held in another mouth, in another moment. He was 14 years old, and he was stating a fact the way people state facts when the fact is simply true and does not require decoration. That was what made it land the way it did. Arya stood in the doorway and felt something shift inside her chest. Not dramatically, not with the clean release of a moment in a film where a character understands something and the music tells you how to feel about it. It was quieter than that. More structural. The specific sensation of a load-bearing assumption giving way somewhere deep in the architecture of how she had understood the morning. She had walked into the operations floor and seen a security violation. She had seen recklessness. She had seen exactly the kind of undisciplined decision-making she had spent years positioning herself against. She had been certain. Completely, efficiently certain. She looked at the apartment now. The careful economy of it. The way the space was organized around necessity, and the specific priorities of a man raising 2 boys on a salary that should have been equity. A kitchen table with homework on one end and a laptop on the other. A couch that had clearly seen more use than sleep. Nothing decorative. Nothing excessive. Everything functional. Everything chosen. Everything quietly held together by someone who had learned not to expect more than what was in front of him. She looked at Kelvin, still watching her from the table. Still saying nothing. She looked at Michael, who had not moved from the doorway. She looked at Troy, phone on his chest, one shoe on, waiting even in sleep for something that might tell him whether it had been enough. What would you do right now in Arya's position? You fired him. You were wrong. The building is failing, and the man you need is asleep in front of you with nothing left to give. Do you wake him? Do you wait? Do you walk back out that door and find another way? Tell us below, because what she chose next, and how Troy responded to it, is the part of this story that changes everything. Arya stepped inside. She did not announce herself. She did not begin arranging words into the shape of an explanation or an apology or a request. She simply moved to the chair across from the couch, sat down, and waited. The apartment was quiet. Kelvin went back to his screen. Michael finished his cereal. Outside, somewhere across the city, 37 monitors were still red. She waited for Troy Stevens to wake up. Troy did not wake up the way people wake up from ordinary sleep. He came back in layers. First the sound, the ambient quiet of the apartment, slightly wrong in a way his body registered before his mind did. Then the weight of where he was, the couch, home, still in his clothes. Then the awareness, arriving with the slow certainty of something that had been waiting for him to be conscious enough to receive it, that something was sitting across from him that should not have been there. He opened his eyes. Arya Stark was in the chair across the room, hands folded, watching him with an expression he had never seen on her before. Not in the years they had built something together. Not in the years after, when building together had become something else entirely. He had seen her confident, calculated, composed, and occasionally cruel in the efficient way that people are cruel when they have decided that a particular outcome justifies the cost of reaching it. He had never seen her look like this. He sat up slowly, one shoe on. He looked at it briefly, then at the room. Kelvin was at the table, laptop closed now, watching. Michael was on the other end of the couch, shoes already on, waiting with the patient stillness of a boy who had learned to read the shape of moments before they fully arrived. Troy looked back at Arya. He said nothing. He waited. She did not arrange it carefully. She did not build toward it or frame it with the kind of professional language that makes difficult things easier to deliver. She told him plainly, the way you tell someone something true when you have run out of the energy required to manage how it lands. The honeypot was down. Hartwell had terminated the processes without knowing what they were. Lazarus had pivoted within minutes. The breach was active. The monitors had been red for nearly 2 hours. The CTO was on the floor but did not have the depth of knowledge the situation required. The engineers were working and losing ground. Nobody in the building had a complete picture of what Troy and his sons had built, which meant nobody had a coherent path to reversing what was now happening. She told him she had fired him before she understood what she was looking at, that she had made a decision in 10 seconds based on an image she had already decided to believe, and that the decision had been wrong, and that she was telling him so not as a strategy but because it was the truth, and he had earned the right to hear it plainly. Then she stopped talking. The apartment was quiet. Troy sat with it for a long moment, not performing the pause, not using silence as leverage or making her wait because waiting would cost her something. He was simply thinking, with the unhurried honesty of a man who had learned not to speak before he knew what he actually meant. When he spoke, his voice was level, unrehearsed, the voice of someone saying a thing they have known for a long time and are now simply giving words to. "I'm not going back for you." Not harshly, not as an accusation, as a fact that needed to be established before anything else could be understood correctly. Not for the title, not for whatever you're prepared to offer to make this easier to ask, not for the equity you owe me. A pause. Not even for the apology. I hear it, but that's not why I'm picking up my jacket. Arya did not interrupt him. There are people in SafeDat servers who have no idea this is happening. Their medical records, their financials, their personal histories. People who never made a single decision about how their data was stored or who was responsible for protecting it. They just trusted that someone was. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "I know what Lazarus does with what they take. I've read the case files. I've seen what it costs. Not the companies, not the executives, not the people who get to issue statements and weather the quarter. The actual people. The ones who find out 6 months later that their identity has been used for something they didn't do, or that their medical history is somewhere it was never supposed to be." He stood up. "That's why I'm going back. So we're clear about what this is." He reached for his jacket on the hook by the door without looking back at Arya. Not dismissively, simply because the decision had been made and there was nothing left in the room that required his attention, except what came next. He looked at his sons. Kelvin was already closing the laptop. The motion was unhurried and completely decisive, the action of someone who had been ready since before the conversation began and was now simply moving. He stood, pushed the chair back, and pulled his backpack from the floor beside the table in a single, smooth sequence. Michael had his shoes on. He had, Arya realized, put them on at some point while Troy was still waking up. He stood from the couch and looked at his father with the quiet readiness of a boy who understood the weight of what they were walking back into and had not needed to be asked twice. Something passed between the three of them that did not require words. The specific and private language of people who have been through enough together that the significant moments no longer need to be announced. Troy opened the door. He did not hold it for Arya with any particular deliberateness, but he did not let it close before she had cleared the frame. She followed him out into the ordinary light of a Thursday afternoon, toward a car, toward a building that was bleeding, toward a problem that had not waited for any of them. Behind her, she heard Michael pull the apartment door shut. Quietly, like someone who intended to come back. They walked to the car without speaking. There was nothing left to say that the next hour would not say better. Troy Stevens walked back onto the operations floor at 1:14 in the afternoon. He did not announce himself. He did not stop at the entrance to read the room or wait for acknowledgement. He came through the door the way he always moved through spaces that required him, directly, without ceremony, already thinking 3 steps ahead of wherever his feet were. But the room felt him arrive. It was not applause. Not the kind of visible, dramatic shift that happens in films when the right person returns at the right moment. It was quieter than that, and more honest. A collective exhale. The specific quality of tension releasing from a group of people who have been managing something beyond their capacity and have just seen the person with the actual capacity come back through the door. Engineers who had been locked to their stations for 2 hours looked up. Some of them had worked alongside Troy for years. Some were newer and knew him only by reputation and by the framework they operated inside every day without knowing his name was on it. All of them felt the same thing. The room had a chance now, It had not had one before. Troy did not acknowledge the shift. He moved directly to the primary console, took the seat that someone vacated without being asked, and began reading the current state of the system with the focused speed of someone who knows exactly what they are looking for and exactly where to look. His sons were already sitting down beside him. Watch this part carefully, because what happens in the next 90 minutes is not something most people in that room had ever seen before, and most of them will spend a long time afterward trying to find the right words for it. Kelvin opened his laptop, pulled up his local environment, and began rebuilding. He did not ask for logs. He did not ask what had been attempted in his absence or where the current failure points were. He had the architecture in his head, not as a reference he was consulting, but as a space he inhabited, the way you know the layout of a place you have spent years inside. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the quiet efficiency of someone doing something they have done enough times that the conscious mind is mostly a passenger. 20 minutes. That was all it took for Kelvin Stevens, 16 years old, to reconstruct from memory a honeypot architecture complex enough to hold the attention of one of the most sophisticated hacker collectives operating anywhere in the world. The engineers watching from behind did not speak. A few of them leaned forward slightly without realizing they had done it. Michael was already 3 steps into his own work before Kelvin finished. He had pulled up the traffic logs from the moment of disconnection and was moving through them with the rapid, instinctive analysis of someone reading a language they grew up speaking. He was not looking for what had gone wrong. He knew what had gone wrong. He was looking for where Lazarus had gone after they pivoted, the exact vector they had chosen when the false architecture disappeared and the real one became visible. He found it in 40 minutes. He mapped the new attack pathway, traced every node Lazarus had touched since the disconnection, and had a complete picture of their current position inside the real architecture laid out on his secondary screen before most of the engineers in the room had fully processed what they were watching. He was 14 years old. Troy worked the perimeter behind them the entire time. Silent. Focused, closing vulnerabilities as his sons managed the misdirection. Each patch precise. Each intervention timed to the rhythm of what Kelvin and Michael were doing at the front. Never ahead of it, never behind it. Perfectly synchronized in the way that people synchronize when they have worked together long enough that the coordination no longer requires conversation. The 3 of them moved through the crisis the way they had moved through the previous 36 hours. Like a unit. Like people who had been built for exactly this. The monitors began changing color at 2:31 in the afternoon. Not all at once. Gradually, station by station. Amber replacing red, and then green replacing amber, spreading across the operations floor in the reverse of how the alarms had fired 3 hours earlier. Engineers called out status updates as each node stabilized. The authentication feeds resynced. The routing anomalies cleared. The suspended transactions that had been caught in the breach pathway were isolated, quarantined, and flagged for manual reconciliation. At 2:47, Troy leaned back from the console and said 2 words to no one in particular. "It's closed." The room released another breath. This one longer than the first. The breach was sealed. The intrusion pathway Lazarus had spent 36 hours constructing and 2 hours actively exploiting had been identified, dismantled, and permanently closed. The authentication configuration had been rebuilt from the ground up. The door they had come through no longer existed. The data held. Not perfectly. There were losses. Transaction batches requiring manual reconciliation. A narrow window of exposure that the security audit would examine in detail. 2 enterprise clients who would receive formal incident notifications before the end of the day. The damage was real, but it was recoverable. The catastrophic outcome: millions of citizens' private records in Lazarus's hands, billions in liability, a company defined permanently by the breach it had failed to prevent, did not happen. The people who stopped it were a 41-year-old man who had been fired that morning, a 16-year-old who rebuilt a complex counter-intrusion architecture entirely from memory, and a 14-year-old who tracked a sophisticated hacker collective across 36 hours of continuous operation and mapped their breach vector in under 40 minutes. None of them stood up when it was over. None of them turned around to receive what the room clearly wanted to give them. Troy checked the final status readout twice, made one additional notation in the incident log, and then sat back in his chair with the stillness of someone who has finished something that needed finishing. Kelvin closed his secondary display. Michael pushed back slightly from the console and stretched his neck to one side, the first purely physical gesture either of them had made in over an hour. The engineers around them began moving again, slowly at first, then with the purposeful energy of people who have work to do and can now actually do it. Nobody asked Troy what came next. Not yet. That conversation belonged to a different hour. For now, the screens were green. For now, it was enough. And somewhere in the record of that Thursday, in the incident logs, the breach timeline, the security audit that would run for weeks afterward, there would be timestamps and technical annotations and formal documentation of everything that had been built and lost and rebuilt. But the names attached to the most important work, one of them was ever going to appear in the official report. The story of what the other two did would take considerably longer to be told correctly. Troy came back for strangers he would never meet. His son spent 36 hours defending a company that did not know their names. And when it was over, none of them asked for a single thing. What do you think should happen next? Does Arya give Troy the equity he was owed from the beginning? Does she offer the boys something? Recognition, compensation, anything? Or does she go back to business as usual now that the crisis is over? Drop your verdict in the comments. Don't go anywhere just yet. There's another story sitting right on your screen and it was put there for a reason. Click it and see why. You've got time for one more. And if this channel has given you something today, a feeling, a thought, something you want to pass on, then subscribe, ring that bell, and make this a place you return to. Every time you open the app, there should be something here waiting for you. And there will be. New stories, real emotions, every time. We're glad you're here, family. Now go watch the next one.